So welcome everyone to Sports Innovation Lab's Ask Me Anything series. My name is Shanna McCardle. I'm the event director at Sports Innovation Lab. We are thrilled to have Professor Judith Grant Long with us today. I will get into her introduction in just a moment, but a few quick reminders. As you know, we started this to provide access to leaders in the industry. We've had an incredible lineup of past guests, and if you have not been able to join us for all of our past Ask Me Anything series, we have all of our recordings posted on our website and on our YouTube channel, so I'll make sure you all have that link. Our Ask Me Anything series continues on Thursday, September 3rd at 1 p.m., when we will be joined by Amy Latimer, who is the president of the TD Garden here in Boston. So looking forward to that conversation. I'll make sure you have that registration link as well. Quick reminder, if you haven't already joined, please join our Slack community. It's active, it's very active, tons of people, great ideas, whether it's a new event or a job posting or new research. It's a great place to meet people and learn new things and share ideas. This is an Ask Me Anything series, so we want to hear your questions. Please use the question function on the right side of your screen. Just type your question in that box at any point throughout the hour, and Josh will ask Judith that question. Now, onto our introductions. You all know Josh Walker. He's the president and co-founder of Sports Innovation Lab. Josh will be leading our conversation today. And now onto our guest, Dr. Judith Grant Long, is a professor at University of Michigan. Judith holds a joint appointment as associate professor of sport management and real estate and associate professor of urban planning at the University of Michigan. Long is an internationally recognized expert in planning, finance, design, and development of sport and tourism infrastructure. Judith's research has been quoted in major newspapers and featured on television and radio in the US, Canada, and other countries around the world. And there is much more to her background. So I highly encourage you to look up more about Dr. Judith Grant Long. But with that, welcome, Judith, and I will pass it over to Josh.
Thank you, Shanna, and thanks for setting this up every week. Professor Long, good to see you, Judith. It's really a pleasure to have you join me today. You know, your bio kind of reads well in the sense of like you're a big deal when it comes to stadium design, district design, planning host cities, and all that stuff. And those are all the topics we're going to cover today. So we've got a good group of people that have already logged on. You guys are welcome to ask questions as we go, but I'm also going to be very selfish and ask all my questions because it's rare that I get a one-on-one time with you. You are on our leadership board. You do help navigate the leaders in the industry around a lot of different topics. Obviously, the last few months have been exceptional on a number of different bases. How has your job changed since March in sort of the work that you're doing, the way that you're even interacting with your students, but also sort of how you're approaching what it is that I would imagine is very different than what you were doing before?
Well, first, let me say, Josh, thanks so much for having me. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. What a thrill to be here with one of my favorite organizations, the Sports Innovation Lab. So, good question. I mean, I'm a college professor, so my world is a little bit different than the folks who are typically on the AMA segment. I'm not in operations, so I'm not in the world day to day, but COVID's had a big impact on what we do on the sport management research side of things. Certainly, we're getting a lot of calls about COVID. I'm doing some research projects that are about COVID, looking at the impact of the pandemic on things like the financing of venues from the public point of view. So that's a big question that I'm getting a lot of calls about. I'm also doing a fair bit of client-based custom training right now, which is partially to do with COVID, but also to do with an initiative that we're going to talk about a little bit later that I'm really excited about, called the Host City Playbook. So I've been doing a lot of that kind of training, doing it, of course, online, but that has enabled me to have actually a pretty far geographical reach. So I've been doing some international work. That's been exciting. But much closer to home, we're all of us in the academic world and all my colleagues in sport management and city planning, we're just trying to figure out out how to deliver a great educational experience for our students in the fall. So we've all been training, learning, we can all functionally use Zoom and their equivalents, but learning all kinds of different ways to engage online. So we've all been doing some of that kind of training as well over the past few months.
And what are Michigan's plans? What are your plans? Are you guys all virtual?
Well, the big question right now is what's the over-under on whether or not Michigan will actually open for in-person instruction in September. Michigan State just announced yesterday that they're going fully online. Some of our other peer institutions, like Notre Dame, is also fully online. So all we've heard from the administration is that we're going to have some in-person experiences and some online. They're marching ahead with having students on campus. But again, I think that the likelihood that we will be shifting online at some point prior to Thanksgiving is very, very high.
Yeah. And you mentioned you're not in the operational side of the business, and it's fair to assume that nobody, when COVID hit, thought, oh my God, get the professor on the line. We need to know what to do. But your window into studying the impact of this pandemic on the way people plan, design, think about venues is I think a luxury in the sense of like having the opportunity to see how people put out fire drills in the past 3 months, next 6 months, how all of the security, healthcare, social distancing, all the equipment, all the sort of modernization stuff that gets accelerated because of this. You're going to get to see all of that. Do you have a sense of how that's going to change the way you do your job, the way you do research, the way your students will be moving into the industry when this pandemic is influencing so many of the organizations that have to build these venues and think about the future of sport?
Well, I think there's two answers to that amongst any, but two that I can think of immediately. One is, how fans will engage with the buildings themselves and engage with the sports industry. That's one very specific area. And then students entering the industry are going to be facing a bunch of changes, including how they're going to carry out their jobs. We're all seeing differences in how the future of work is sort of playing out in front of us. We'll all be working more remotely, so on and so forth. I think the students are also, at least in the short term, going to be entering into an industry that is under short-term contraction. So the job opportunities are going to be a little bit lesser. But on the plus side, or the opportunity that I see here is really relevant to the Sports Innovation Lab audience, because it's technology. Technology is going to be a huge opportunity area as we find our way out of this particular solution. And that's not just technology in terms of how we get data to figure out how to better operate our buildings, but it's also, the use of technology and how we work in the industry. So I see these two areas really coming together and creating new kinds of opportunities for students entering into the market. So that's the big change.
We've leaned on your expertise a lot in thinking about what happens around the venue too, because I think for most people listening in, maybe they're not aware that your expertise are not just about the venue itself, but about what's around it. So can you talk a little bit about how you approach venue, districts, those types of things, and really kind of give people a sense of what your purview is?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because again, I'm not really an operations person. I come at the question of sports venues from the city planning, architecture, real estate development, and economic development purviews. So I'm kind of an unusual person in that I marry all of these different disciplines. But my perspective is really about the building and then how the building faces out. And this has become incredibly important. Part of the work that I'm doing with the Sports Innovation Lab is really tracking district formation. And our last count on district formation is that it's upwards, climbing towards 50% of major league venues are located in some form of district. They can be informal, they can be formal, they can be large, they can be small. But the idea that there's a mixed use element, meaning office, hotel, residential, retail, so forth. The idea that there's a mixed use component that is part of the planning and the sort of larger scale operations of the venue, and the reach of the team is becoming the dominant construct of how we think about developing venues, certainly in the US and in Canada. And I think that model is really starting to sort of catch fire in the European market as well. And I'm sure we'll begin to extend beyond that.
Do you have a definition of what a district is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a district in my parlance, or using my definition, would be something that is formally created, which means that there is a plan that has been approved by a city council, typically a city council, maybe a higher level of government, that says, here is a district, we're going to draw a boundary, and we're going to say that this is our sport and entertainment district. It may have a major league venue, it may have a minor league venue or a college venue, there may be a convention element or a performing arts element. So it could have one of these things, all of these things, but the idea that there are some anchor elements that attract visitors, and then those visitors drive the creation of other kinds of uses in the vicinity. So they drive the retail, they drive the office commercial, they drive the hotel, so on and so forth. So for me, a district is a more formal construct, but there are certainly plenty of cases, and I think it's probably 40% of the districts that we see in the United States and Canada are informal, in the sense that the venue is either the venue arrived after this sort of constellation of convention and retail things were there, so having a different timeline and maybe not having a specific boundary. So there's informal and there's formal. I'm more concerned with the formal ones, because typically if there's a boundary, and if there was a public funding mechanism like a bond issue or tax increment financing, then that gives me something that's much more concrete to research in terms of what the city was looking for, what the private sector was looking for, and how the results panned out. The informal ones,
because there was a plan, because there were some metrics for success, because there were some design elements that you could say, did this meet its goals? That's really where the district definition comes into play, because I think, to your point, we've seen this anecdotally, there's just a lot of venues that are starting to add all these amenities that are starting to look like a small city. And you're like, well, is this what Professor Long would consider a district? And I think your definition is helpful in the sense of like, well, look, if it's a formal plan, if there's real goals and we can measure the success of the investment longer term, then I consider that a district. So just because you have a venue and it all of a sudden adds a Top Golf and some, DraftKings fantasy zone, it's not really a district.
That's not a district, right? Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then what's the big trend? What's the big pattern that you're seeing? How are districts sort of being designed? And what do you expect to be coming next?
So another great question. One of the takeaways of a lot of the work that we've done on districts, and by the way, I have a great team of students at the University of Michigan who help me with this, because we have a course on sport and entertainment districts, which I think is the only one presently in the world, which is kind of exciting.
In the world?
In the world, yeah. I think there's lots of...
Drop the mic on that one, Professor Long.
Yeah,
boom.
Well, the University of Michigan really is a big leader in sport management, and we have a really large faculty that does all kinds of fantastic things. So when we think about districts, the trend is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. In most cases, there's a wide variety of sizes. So some are really large, like the Battery in Atlanta, which is anchored by the Atlanta Braves ballpark, but also has a lot of retail, has a lot of restaurants, has a small hotel element, has office commercial, has a whole bunch of stuff on a fairly large site. Then there's also some really, really small ones that are really the venue and a couple of parcels of real estate around the venue that they've picked up piecemeal. So the scale can be widely ranging, and then also the nature of the mix of uses can be very different. So some Some, again, the Battery in Atlanta, have a wide variety of uses. Others maybe just have one use that they focus on, which might be a hotel, for example. So they've got the venue, they've got a sprinkling of retail, and then they have a hotel. And by the way, the sprinkling of retail is pretty common throughout the district, so they can all carry a little bit of retail. But the rest of the mix of the uses is really market responsive. So it depends on, are you in New York City? Are you in Atlanta? Are you in Milwaukee? Are you in Cincinnati? How much land do you have available, and what makes use in the context of what makes sense, in the context of that market. So the big trend is that there isn't a roadmap in terms of scale and mix of uses. But even though that's true, we are figuring out certain things. Like, we know that certain venues attract certain kinds of uses. Certain locations attract different kinds of uses. So if you're urban, suburban, if you're a ballpark or an arena or a football stadium, we know that if you cluster your sports venue with a convention center and or a performing arts venue, that you're able to attract X and Y different kinds of uses. So we're beginning to have some data that helps us understand the relationship between the kinds of venues that are being used to anchor the district, the size of the district, and then the kinds of mixed use that they can attract, right? So we're really trying to solve this question of, if you have X venue and Y land, what really makes sense in terms of the mixed use that you can add on in that situation.
So you think most people wound up with the usage of their district by mistake? No, I think, so I think there's two things. It's kind of a great question, because I think that when teams and when politicians and when certain private developers imagine a mixed-use district around a venue, they have imaginings of tall buildings and offices and hotels and so forth. So they have a vision, but then that vision doesn't always necessarily translate with what the market is willing to support at a given time. So I think there are visions that are used to sell district formation, and in particular to sell some of the financial arrangements that support district formation. And then there's the reality, which you will get the venue and maybe you get a sprinkling of things, but you don't get sort of all the pretty pictures that were part of the approvals process. So Gidon, has spoken with me in the past, and he's joined today, and he said, what are the long-term repercussions that you anticipate with stadia design and location following the lessons learned from recent events? I think we touched on that a little bit earlier, but I think the second part of his question is probably something we could talk a little bit further about, which is, will the technology being developed today sort of shape the future design of sports facilities? So you made a strong point that technology is going to have a huge impact, but are there specific technologies that you look at that you think are going to have a bigger impact on sort of how people plan districts in the future? Is it, I'm thinking driverless cars, I'm thinking sort of, any sort of utilities that are going to be easier to access. What are the main drivers from a technology perspective that you think will have the greatest impact on how they're designed in the future?
That's a great question. I mean, I think when we look internally inside the venue, there are certain principles that are, they're COVID specific, but they're also future specific. When we talk about, for example, the keyword of flexibility of space, such that you can have different types of events and more events, right? So flexibility is a big word in terms of design moving forward. There's all the technology associated with the fan experience, all that stuff that goes on inside the building, and the technology of security and so forth. But when we look outside the building, which is, again, my main purview, certainly there's technology that's happening urbanistically speaking. And a great example there is, the driverless car technology, or even rideshare, right? Like rideshare is not at this point a new technology, but 10 years ago, it was becoming a new technology, and it changed the way we planned some of the transportation infrastructure around venues. So that's an example. The part that I'm actually paying a lot of attention to right now, which may not have a physical manifestation, specifically the same way driverless cars would, but it certainly has a financial implication, is how we carry technology like 5G from inside the venue to outside the venue. And in particular, when the infrastructure for that technology needs to extend out into the district in order for, all of the wonderful fan experience and stuff to continue outside of the venue. And of course, for, whoever is the operator to be able to monetize those venues. But if the district is also a public space, some of them are privately owned, but some of them are publicly owned. When it's a public space, it becomes a very tricky question about how that technology is implemented and provided for in the area outside of the district. So I'm talking with host cities about how you cost share for that sort of thing. What does it cost? What does it look like when you try to implement that kind of a new technology in an area outside of what would be a traditionally private space? So that's.
I mean, the complexity of what you just described is enormous. I mean, you said in your definition of a district that it helps if the district has boundaries, right? And the concept of a boundary for 5G is not that easy to describe. No. But I also think of the terms of boundaries when it comes to things that might be more connected to the fan experience, like loyalty programs that may connect all of the retail that's in the district, quote unquote, in the district. So again, thinking about boundaries, my pizza parlor may be outside the district, so I can't participate in this loyalty program that ties together everything else that's in the district. And I just think that this concept of a physical boundary for a thing that is connected with technology is really challenging to understand.
And to me, that's the piece I'm focusing on a good deal in terms of the technology. I mean, there are also other elements in design and
because because in your estimation, it has a direct correlation to who funds what. Because if it's a public utility like Wi-Fi, maybe the government that's investing in this or has some stake in this says, look, we'll cover that piece because it's a utility for our population. But if it's just for the sports fans and it's, a private network, a private 5G network, and it's high speed, but it's only there because people are going to be gambling and watching video and doing all the things that are related to the sports activities, the public guys are going to be like, no, we're not that interested.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's exactly the tension that we're playing with, because it's going to be expensive, and it's going to become just another element of the public and private partnership that provides, sort of a lot of the funding for these kinds of massive developments.
Okay. Well, I don't want to make light of it because I'm totally impressed with the idea that you're writing a book about this. You called it the Host City Playbook. I feel like I'm Oprah and I'm having my book club and, you're here to talk about something that millions and millions of people are going to read. But tell me what's in the book.
So the Host City Playbook, this is kind of exciting. There isn't a lot of material that addresses the specific audience of host cities. And part of the challenge. And
for people, not to interrupt you, but I think it's super helpful if we're going to go this direction. What's a host city?
So a host city can be anything, really. I mean, the traditional example is the Olympics, right? So Tokyo is going to host maybe the Olympics in 2020 or 2021 now, right? So they are the host city for this particular event. It's not a very clear definition because while the city of Tokyo is footing, I think, about 60% of the bill, the government of Japan is involved and so on and so forth, right? So, but the idea that the host city can be both financial, but it's typically geographic, right? So if
Boston hosts the NCAA tournament, are they a host city?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And again, the host city is typically identified geographically, but very often there's money coming from other levels of government as well. So it's
is there a time that makes something a host city? Again, I don't want to split hairs here, but like,
did you say?
Yeah, like a time base. Like if they're doing this over a certain number of weeks, a certain number of years, like is there something that makes the host a host versus just like, the NCAA tournament's going to hold one of their games here and then they're moving on. Like, are there certain commitments?
No, Not really.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a very capacious definition. Right?
Okay.
So it means a bunch of different things. But it does capture the idea that there are city governments as well as state governments, county governments,
That are
national
involved in this
governments
decision. Yep.
that
got
are
it.
trying to figure
Okay.
this out. And the tension exists because for taking major league venues as an example, the folks that provide consulting advice or build venues, so sort of the construction companies, they do these kinds of projects all over the world all the time, right? They're very familiar
AG,
with
Oakview, those big groups. They're expert at doing this. Yep.
Populous, the big firms that are doing it. This is what they do for a living. For
Yep.
host cities, and sometimes, by the way, team owners, franchise owners, this is a once in a lifetime project, or maybe they do two in a 30-year cycle. So there's no deeply held expertise or any competency in really
No pattern
understanding.
recognition, nothing like that.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a very specific, what we call in real estate development, a very specific asset class, meaning sports venues, convention centers, performing arts, which are typically clustered together. So we have this challenge where we have these very rare projects, and host cities typically, let's be honest, they fumble the ball a lot when it comes to delivering what are considered to be good deals. And that can be measured financially, it can be measured economically, it can be measured socially, a bunch of different ways. But generally speaking, host cities get really roasted about the fact that they don't deliver particularly good ROI for taxpayers. So the host city playbook is trying to address a lot of these sort of shortcomings in the internal capacity of the governments that deliver these events, but also build these venues. And the basis for the book really comes from a lot of the conversations that I have with host cities. I do a lot of speaking on this issue. I do custom training for host cities to try to teach them a lot of the skills that they need in order to be able to better participate in this deal. So you asked what's in the book. Some examples are, I break down the concept of what is ROI from a public point of view when it comes to a major event or building a venue. How do they do some of the basic modeling? So we're gonna build an arena. How do we figure out how much revenue the arena brings in relative to the capital cost of building the venue? They very often don't have even a basic understanding of how the revenues and expenses work relative to the capital structure of the project, right? So they don't understand income relative to cost. And if they don't understand income relative to cost, it's very difficult for them to really create a deal that is beneficial to taxpayers. So we teach them a little bit of that modeling, done in Excel. It's all super easy. We teach them about market studies, what it means to understand their market for, it could be major league sports, but it could also be for major conventions and so forth, or events. We teach them about economic impact analyses, how those work, what the major flaws are, what to look for when your consultant produces one for you. We teach them about the venues, how they're designed, what to look for, what are the trends in design. And then we, bring it all to best practices. So the point that we're in with the book right now is that a lot of the material has been written, but we're finishing up talking to our host cities about their best practices. So that's where we are. We're just finishing up sort of getting the state of the state of affairs, the state of the union from our host cities to get a sense of what they think they've either done really well and examples of that, or challenges that they find when they go to negotiate these kinds of projects.
I think this addresses some of what Lindsay's asking in her question, but certainly some of the work that we've done with the IOC, which is they hope to have a blueprint, right, that they can kind of give to the next host city on what works well and everything else. And that's been an ambition of theirs for a while. So I think your book could serve well in sort of accelerating that, because it hasn't been done to the level that I think people feel like we won't repeat Rio's mistakes, or Tokyo's completely different because of XYZ. So, if you can give them sort of that playbook that allows them to pull different levers and get different answers, that certainly seems valuable. But Lindsay asked sort of the white elephant question, which is, I know recent global events have hampered the ability to upkeep the venues that they invest in. So are there best practices, or is there something in your book or in your studies that leads to better planning so that there's a legacy plan, right? And I think this is what Lindsay's referring to, which is like, if you make all this investment, how do you model maybe even just the financial obligation to upkeep these venues? And how do you really, what are the inputs into modeling the revenue, the potential to sustain the funding required to do that?
Is the question about the Olympic Games specifically, Josh, to clarify?
No, it's just as global events, but World Cup, Olympics, take your pick. There's a lot of these venues that are built, and now they're modular, and people make the claim that they could break them down and, build them. But like traditionally it's been, let's use the fact that the World Cup's coming to build this new thing, or let's use the fact that we're a host city to build this new thing. And there's many, many stories of like, that was a one-shot, deal.
Mm-hmm. So this is an essential tension, right? Between so I'm going to use the Olympics example because I think it's a very different kind of situation with the Olympics than it is for major league and even minor league venues in the North American market. I'm happy to take a question about that, but let's focus on venues that are driven by super large events, mega events like FIFA World Cup Soccer or the Olympic Games and so forth. And I think without getting into a lengthy history of how the IOC and host cities have not necessarily generated outcomes that have been beneficial to host cities from the perspective of venues. I think that the tension that we've been sort of under over the last 10 to 15 years with the Olympic Games has played out in the decision by the IOC to basically halt the host city selection process, and to they designated Paris and LA for 2024 and 2028 respectively, and basically they're trying to use this time to really understand how they can foment a better partnership, a more productive partnership between the IOC and host cities, because we're still having these extraordinarily high cost Olympics relative to venues that don't necessarily get used a tremendous amount. And unfortunately, like Rio was another case. London was probably a little bit of a better case, and Rio was a worse case again. So the situation with the IOC and host cities, the way I see it, is that the IOC is trying very hard to get host cities to use things like existing venues and temporary venues. And by the way, just a little bit of a parenthetical or a sidebar on the temporary venues. Temporary venues are in the short term tend to be more expensive, right? Because you have to build them, you have to bring all the materials in. There's a lot of cost associated with building a temporary venue, and in fact, that can sometimes exceed the cost of building a new venue. The value of the temporary venue is that in the long term, you don't have the opportunity cost of that venue, which might not be used at all, occupying the space, so that you can then build something else or do something more productive for that city with that land. So temporary venues are a little bit of a solution, but they're not much of a solution from a cost point of view. So, getting back to the question of the IOC and host cities, the IOC has been working very hard to try to get the host cities to lessen their sorry, we're having a bit of a video issue, so I got a little bit distracted. But the IOC is working really hard to get the host cities to be less ambitious. And the host cities, I have to say, haven't really been playing the game, right? So I think the host cities have been working really hard, but the IOC's been working really hard, but the host cities continue to come back with these, multi-billion-dollar plans. So in a way, the host cities are a bigger problem than the IOC, which means that the IOC is really hard pressed to solve this particular problem. And so it may be that this knowledge transfer program, Josh, that they've been, by the way, they've been doing it for years at the IOC.
Oh yeah, no, it's nothing new. Yeah.
I think it's very difficult to solve this problem at the IOC level, and in fact, I'm hoping that the host city playbook even though it's not necessarily targeted to the Olympic problem, maybe a future edition would be, it will make host cities be more thoughtful about the ROI, and then they can use that mechanism when evaluating their own plans instead of relying on the IOC to do the plan evaluation, which I think is the problem. People tend to think it's an IOC problem, and I would actually argue that it's more so a host city problem. And hopefully some of this work will start to unpack a more beneficial solution going forward.
Well, while you were answering that question, Lindsay did chime in and say, I'm more interested in sort of the mega sport events, not just the Olympics. Is there a discernible difference because of the way you just answered that question, that the IOC takes such an active role in this? Like, does the World Cup have the same issue? I mean, do some of the other...
I would distinguish the Olympic Games and FIFA World Cup soccer, frankly, from just about every other mega event, because they are the two that have very large scale construction.
So who does it well? I mean, who does it well without a lot of large scale construction? Do you have
you can name.
Yeah.
If you want to make a list of, here's events that are actually really economically and socially productive for host cities, and here's events that are less so, you know what the things that are great are the world championships for skating, for swimming, right? You know, they're not building anything new, and they're bringing in a fair number of people, so they're bringing in new economic money, but it's not such a large number of people that are being accommodated that you need to build new hotel capacity, so on and so forth. So it's really there's lots of sporting events, as well as, by the way, convention-based events that are much better ROI than the kinds of events where there are huge capital costs. For example,
so it sounds like there's an audience sweet spot for this. It's almost like a Goldilocks rule, where you don't want it to be too big, they have to build new facilities, but you don't want it to be too small that it brings no economic development to the area.
Well, one of the examples, this is much more smaller scale. So Lindsay, this is actually sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, but this gets talked about a fair bit at the conferences that I go to. When smaller cities are taking lessons from bigger cities and bigger events, one of the things that's being talked about in smaller cities is you don't necessarily have to build like a new soccer complex or an 8,000 seat arena. What you want to be able to accommodate is the highest impact, or one of the highest impact ROI events that you can have right now, is girls' youth volleyball tournaments. Because regionally or statewide, they bring in a ton of people and their parents, and they take up all the hotel rooms. They could be 3-star, 4-star hotels. They're not really expensive hotels, but they all eat their meals there. And the economic boost is tremendous, right? So helping host cities really understand, as Josh put it, finding their sweet spot. And they may need to build to get to that sweet spot, but if they are thoughtful about how they come up with a capital construction plan to get to the point where they can accommodate the kinds of events that make sense regionally in their market, they will be much better off than trying to build something that, just makes them a major league host or whatever, right? So there's a lot to learn.
I don't think a lot of people understand how much of a regional economic benefit there is to the youth sports touring tournaments. It's like the hotels huge. And it's more of a hospitality business than it is a sports business. So it's fascinating.
And it's all that new money, right? And the new money that makes your economic impact analysis sing.
Right.
Josh and I are both parents, so we understand.
We do. We've seen those bills. Yes. So we're getting close to the bottom of the hour here. I did want to touch a little bit on Tokyo. This is a really unique situation. Angela mentions this all the time. You can count on one hand how many times the Olympics has had to make significant changes in their plans to host or run a games. On one hand, I mean, this is unprecedented, and everybody says that about COVID in general, but this is unprecedented that a host city who's invested so much and been so emotionally invested in sort of bringing the games to Tokyo. Where's your head on this? How do they find a silver lining here? How do they utilize some of the investments they've made? If someone was to call you up right now and ask your advice on that, what would you tell them?
So it's interesting. I mean, we don't have the final word about Tokyo now 2021, right? We don't have the final word yet, but I think should it come to pass that the IOC says we're just going to bypass it and we're going to go directly to 2024. I think that the obvious solution is to say Tokyo gets 2032, right? So that's got to be the first thing out of anybody's, out of anybody's playbook is give Tokyo 2032. Yes, their venues will be at that point 12 years old, maybe not as shiny, but they'll have all of their infrastructure in place. The only challenge, and not insurmountable, is that they were, of course, building this spectacular Olympic Village right on Tokyo Bay. It's a lot of condos, and there's a lot of people who actually already have deposits on those condos. So they're going to have to put those units out to market. So they're going to have to find another site to build. The Olympic Village, but maybe there's an affordable housing opportunity somewhere. But it's really hard to say that there's a silver lining for Tokyo because this is just really unfortunate for the organizing committee, for the athletes, for the IOC. This is just an incredibly tough situation. But I do think that Tokyo will at least be able to recoup a significant portion of this investment, even if it's 12 years down the road.
Well, I'm going to ask Gidon's last questions, and then I'm going to ask you to wrap up and let me know how you want to do that. So keep that in the back of your mind. But his questions are very specific. It's, what in your mind is the incentive for host cities like DC to host a World Cup game? And then I'll ask the second part of his question.
So what's in their mind? Is that the question?
No, yeah. What in your mind is the incentive for a city like DC to host a World Cup game? Well, how would they justify doing that? If they can use an existing venue, right? So if they can use an existing venue, it's pretty simple. The economic impact is what they're looking for. So basically, they want to bring a whole bunch of people from outside DC to come in to watch a match. Hopefully they'll stay overnight. Maybe they will. I imagine there'll be some significant percentage that would stay overnight, stay in a hotel, eat dinner. Even the folks from DC will come to the area. They'll come to the area of the venue. They will, eat out. They'll celebrate. They'll be able to market the city. So, sort of all the economic boxes, when you don't have to build something, if you're making use of an existing venue, that becomes, economically very easy to see the benefit. This is the Super Bowl argument, right? Which is the public sector spends a lot of money on a venue, and then theoretically it gets paid back, for in the case of the NFL with the Super Bowl, or at least some portion thereof. So the appeal to DC, to me, once you have a venue that you can use, if there's an MLS venue in the case of soccer, once that venue's there, any other event that you can operate at that, it's going to be a win-win, right? So that makes complete sense for me. And in the host city playbook, that would be an excellent event to chase. Right. Okay. And then the second part of his question is, do you think you'll see more frequently in the future for these mega events, multiple nation hosts? The idea that, multiple, and they're doing that with the World Cup, right? I mean, isn't that what Mexico, Canada, and the US are doing? Yeah,
the sort of North American World Cup. I think it'll be really interesting. I mean, the IOC has said that they're interested in doing this. Of course, they made some changes to their charter that said that that's possible. The challenge with multiple hosts, or the multiple national hosts, particularly in the context of the Olympic Games, is the contractual obligations for overruns. And not only, and then you're not just negotiating with one country and their government, but you're negotiating with two, and that's that's obviously double the complexity. And so you have to have some benefit, right? And there are lots of cases where countries and host cities are completely capable of having all of the venues within a regional, sort of a regional layout, right? But there are cases, particularly in Europe, where it might make sense to have stuff across borders. And maybe we'll have an example sometime soon. But again, the complexity of working across to national level governments. It just makes everything from a legal point of view.
A little more bureaucracy, so to speak. Yeah. Well, you know that our talk track for this industry is based in research that says that the diehard fan is not the future of growth, but a fluid fan is. And we define the fluid fan as wanting to go to a sporting event, a live media entertainment event that really gives the fan options to do different things, because it's not always about what's happening on the court or what's happening on the field. So these districts really scratch that itch for these fans that aren't diehard sports fans, but they really want to have an amazing experience. So your research is something we pay a lot of attention to. Your advice in how we guide our own research in this area is something I look forward to and definitely rely on heavily. I want to thank you for joining us today, but I always like to give our guests the last word. If there's something that you want to leave the audience with, and really thinking about sort of what's coming in the book, but also what you think is dominating the conversation today, what's your last piece of advice for people as they try to navigate the waters in the next 6 months? Everybody's very near-term focused right now, Professor Long, and they don't have that 12, 24-month horizon anymore. They're really like, oh my God, everything's burning. What do you tell them? How do you calm the waters and really look into your crystal ball based on the research you've done in the past?
Well, I think I can leave on an optimistic note, which is to say that those of us who are in the world of the sports industry and in sports districts, where that involves also the convention and performing arts industries, I think that we can point to a remarkable history of being able to contribute in the context of emergencies. So Katrina, COVID, et cetera, the venues play actually an important role in emergency planning for many major cities. And so in that respect, planning well for them and having an emergency partnership plan where the venue can be made available and thinking about how they can be made available during emergencies, I think is a really proud history of our industry and something that we've become very good at in the last 15 to 20 years. But I also think that, outside of people directly affected by the emergency, the continuing availability of venues, particularly outdoor venues that have retail and other kinds of open spaces that give folks a place to gather that is safe outside right now has actually been pretty wonderful, right? So if you think about the Battery or the Star District in Frisco, right? The Stars in Frisco. But I think that the districts are actually providing an important kind of public space, even if they're privately owned, but they're creating this public space that allows us, in the context of COVID, to be outside, to be able to enjoy outdoor restaurants and so forth. So, the district formation has an important element in providing this new kind of, outdoor mall, whatever you want to call it, but it's become an important public space. So
I love that. I love that answer so much. I mean, because it's a reminder of the essential infrastructure that these venues play in our cities, whether it's for, emergency location, shelter, convening people to take care of them. That's what venues have historically been. Love that answer. It's something that's so overlooked in this. It's certainly where testing is happening now. There's lots of different ways that venues have been repurposed. And then look, at the end of the day, sports is the thing that keeps us together. It's a distraction, but it's also a passion. And so having a place where even if we can't go in the stadium or the arena itself, but we can be together in a place that is familiar and has positive vibes to it, that's what a district is.
Absolutely.
I love it. No, that's perfect. And look, I hope you stay safe. I hope your students are safe. I hope that Michigan figures out what they're doing so you're not on Zoom all semester long. But if you are on Zoom, I hope you figure out how to get your big house behind you again, because that virtual background is pretty sweet. And I'm sorry our audience didn't get to see it today, but Professor Long has the
Zoom,
big house on behind her when she does her Zoom calls. Thank you so much for joining. Stay safe. And for all of you, join us again on September 3rd, I believe, when Amy Latimer joins me to talk about what they've been doing in their district over at TD Garden in Boston. Professor Long, take care of yourself. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone. Please be in touch if you have any questions.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.